Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. This is Bridge City News. Here are some of the top stories that we've been following. Just hours before French language debate in Montreal, the Leaders Debate Commission rescinds its invitation to Green Party to participate. Plus, Montreal Canadiens host Carolina Hurricanes tonight for a chance at playoffs, the high-stakes game even impacting the French language debate. And we hear from outraged residents of an Alberta town who won't get a federal election polling station in their community.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Jeanette Roche.
Thanks so much for joining us. Green Party co-leader Jonathan Pedneau says the last-minute decision to remove his party from the debate is unfounded and undemocratic. Earlier this morning, the Leaders Debate Commission rescinded its invitation to the Green Party to participate in the two federal leaders' debates. The commission cites the party made a strategic decision not to run candidates in every riding after initially telling the commission it would. The decision comes just hours before the French language debate is scheduled to take place in Montreal and one day before the English debate.
The Commission itself admitted in its letter that we received this morning at 7:20 that their decision infringes on our freedom of expression, but more importantly, that it infringes on the right of Canadians to be informed when they go to the poll and make their decision about who will lead this country moving forward. This decision from the Debates Commission today does not protect democracy. It protects those who've already had their turn. It protects the ones who pave over the truth, who bulldoze through public interest and leave the rest of us to pick up the pieces. But here's what they forget. When they bulldoze, when they pave, green always grows, and it will keep on growing. I fully expect to be at the debates tonight. I fully expect the Debate Commission to reverse their decision, their undemocratic decision.
It is possible the debate won't be the most watched matchup tonight. The Montreal Canadiens host the Carolina Hurricanes this evening, and it's an important game because it gives them the opportunity to clinch a playoff spot in their last regular season game. The Canadiens will need to pick up either a win or an overtime loss against Carolina. The high stakes have even impacted the federal election campaign, with the French language leaders debate having to begin 2 hours earlier than originally planned to minimize a conflict. Here is Daniel Rainbird with the Canadian Press.
The Montreal Canadiens this season, it's been a really special season for the team. Coming into the year, I don't think they would have expected to be here with a chance to clinch a playoff spot in their final regular season game. So they've had 3 straight games where they could have secured their place in the playoffs, but they've let that slip. And now suddenly what looked really improbable, what looked like almost a sure thing that they would make the playoffs, might not happen. They need at least a point tonight against the Carolina Hurricanes to qualify. They could still make it if they don't get a point tonight, but the Columbus Blue Jackets would have to fail to win in regulation time tomorrow night when they host the New York Islanders.
Now back to the other battlefield, the political one. Liberal leader Mark Carney has stated that by keeping the industrial carbon tax, we are making the large companies pay for everybody. However, a Léger poll released Tuesday by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation shows 70% of Canadians believe businesses pass on most or some of the cost of the industrial carbon tax to consumers. Meanwhile, just 9% businesses pay for most of the cost. CTF Federal Director Franco Terrazzano says the polls show Canadians understand that a carbon tax on business is a carbon tax on Canadians that makes life more expensive. The Léger poll asked Canadians who they think ultimately pays the industrial carbon tax. Ontario has tabled legislation to make trade between provinces easier as a way to shore up the economy against effects of American tariffs. The bill would make Ontario the first government in Canada to unconditionally remove all current exceptions to interprovincial free trade. Doug Ford also signed memorandums of understanding with the premiers of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, supporting the removal of trade barriers between those provinces.
Today is just such a great day for Ontario. It's a great day for Canada. Today, we're taking a historic step forward to protect and unify our country, to build up Canada's economy by tearing down internal trade barriers. The cost of these barriers to our economy is absolutely enormous. Across the country, internal trade barriers increase the cost of everyday goods and services by nearly 15%. They reduce our national GDP by more than 7% and cost our economy up to $200 billion every single year. In other words, much like President Trump's tariffs, these trade barriers hurt our economy, drive away jobs and investment, and divide us from each other.
What an opportunity we have in this moment. So we have to seize this moment. We have to act on this moment and make sure that we open up true free trade across Canada. So we've been in Nova Scotia. We've been very focused on this. We passed a piece of legislation. Basically, that legislation is all about good enough for Canadians, then good enough for Canadians. Something that's good enough for another part of the country is good enough for Nova Scotia.
That uncertainty we're feeling, and now we have an opportunity to take that uncertainty and act in ways that protect Canada, protect Ontario, and protect New Brunswick by removing trade barriers and moving forward as a strong and united Team Canada.
The bill will also remove barriers for people who work certain jobs to find employment in different provinces. If you live in the tiny Alberta towns of Carmangay or Champion, voting in the federal election is going to be a bit of a challenge. That is because residents of those villages will have to travel to Lamond to attend the nearest voting station. Champion is a quiet community of approximately 400 residents and is comprised mainly of seniors. Elections Canada deemed their usual polling station, the Pioneer Club, to not meet polling station requirements despite being recently renovated. Bridge City News visited Champion to hear reactions from the community's residents.
It's absolutely stupid. It's ridiculous. We've always been able to vote here in town. It just seems a little bit weird to have to go that far. I mean, even to Vulcan is one thing that's, why can't we go to Vulcan?
We've always voted at the Pioneer Club every election, whether it's federal, provincial, or municipal. And they never told anybody. I guess our mayor didn't even know. So it's kind of hard because there's a lot of seniors in town that don't drive, and it's 30 minutes drive from here.
They deemed it inaccessible and unsafe, I think they noted the building to be. So with all our, accessibility ramps and, door access and the brand new renovation, a lot of that really doesn't add up in my opinion. So I don't know. It seems very one-sided and unfair to everybody around here.
Elections Canada says it's a byproduct of the recent redrawing of riding boundaries. In a statement, they also say there are no locations within these communities that meet Elections Canada's requirements for polling locations, given the age of most of the buildings. Alberta is without a chief medical officer of health after the government declined to renew the contract of Dr. Mark Joffe. The Office of Health Minister Adriana LaGrange said Tuesday that Joffe's contract had expired a day earlier. It says an interim replacement will be announced shortly and that a search for a permanent replacement has begun. Joffe was serving in the role on an interim basis after the provincial government fired Dr. Dina Hinshaw in 2022. Alberta is changing how hospital surgeries are funded. The province is looking to tie funding to where patients receive actual care instead of giving one lump sum to the hospital. Dr. Brian Day, orthopedic surgeon and founder of the Cambie Surgeries Corporation, sees the difference between this model and what other countries are doing.
We are unique in that among OECD countries in completely funding our hospitals by giving them a lump sum at the beginning of the year. So, a large hospital might be given $3 billion a year, so that every patient that goes to that hospital is using up the hospital's money. in every other public system, it doesn't matter whether it's public or private, when the patient goes to a hospital in, say, England or Denmark or New Zealand, when a patient goes to the public hospital, they get funding by the government for their procedure. So the end result is that an administrator in a public hospital in other countries wants patients, because without patients they don't have revenue, whereas an administrator in a public hospital in Canada, the last thing they want is patients, because they use up their annual revenue.
Catch my full interview with Dr. Brian Day, along with Chris Galloway, Executive Director of Friends of Medicare, who opposes the idea. All of that coming up later in the program. A confirmed case of measles is prompting a public alert to potential exposures in Lethbridge. On April 11th, an infected person visited Costco between 3:30 and 7 p.m. and also the South Side Walmart between 5 and 8 p.m. According to Alberta Health Services, anyone who was at those stores at those times who was born in or after 1970 and has less than 2 documented doses of the measles vaccine is at risk for developing measles. They should self-monitor for symptoms and review their immunization records. After recovering a stolen truck and high-end bicycle, Lethbridge police arrested 2 men. On April 15th, the owner of a Ford F-150 previously reported stolen from Coaldale saw the vehicle near the Par 3 golf course and attempted to block it in. A man exited and ran into the coulees while the driver rammed the other vehicle, then fled in the truck. LPS and RCMP coordinated a search of the river valley and located the passenger hiding in the coulees. The other man was later seen in possession of a high-end bicycle. After an eventual foot race, the man was apprehended. During a search, he was found to have had on him the Ford keys and methamphetamine, and police determined the bike that he was riding had been stolen from Brooks. Quinn Mitchell-Pazzo, age 28 of Brooks, was arrested. He is currently in custody awaiting a judicial interim release hearing. The Lethbridge Police Service have introduced their newest 4-legged member of the force, a near 2-year-old Belgian Malinois, who will serve with the LPS K-9 unit. Brandon was acquired by the Alabama Canine Law Enforcement Officers Training Center in November and was trained for 14 weeks by his new handler, Constable Terry Fegut. Brandon becomes the 34th LPS police dog to join the service's K-9 unit since its inception in 1964, and the 4th K-9 team to assist the frontline patrols team and critical incident team.
This is my second dog now, so I had a really good bond with my first dog, Zep, who we had to retire last year, unfortunately. However, I didn't think a bond could be built as strong again. However, Brandon has proven me wrong in that, and he's a complete opposite of my first dog. But just going through the experience of learning everything together again has brought us so close together, and to have him and know he has the ability to do the job and have my back for the next 7 to 8 years on the street is just a cool, overwhelming feeling.
Love those dogs. Congratulations, Brandon. Well, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation released their data on housing starts in Canada for March. And here in Alberta, we are seeing a continuous rise in starts from this time last year. The province saw a total of over 11,000 housing starts from January to March in 2025, compared to just over 9,700 starts from the same time frame in 2024. Here in Lethbridge, the city saw an increase from 138 to 184 total starts from this time last year, an increase of 33%. Calgary and Edmonton were among the highest numbered increase in housing starts in the country, including increases of 16% and 17% respectively. This is all despite the national average of starts being down 9%. Lance Krogman, owner of Lealta Building Supplies in Lethbridge, says he's noticed his sales are consistent with that of the increase of starts in the city.
So we are seeing more people coming in the door this year for quotes and buying for their housing and additions and decks and garages and things like that. We're up 30% over last year just in sales already. You know, the new house market is quite large in Lethbridge. Renovations are quite relevant too. Right now, I would say we're seeing about 50-50. There's quite a few more starts in multifamily this year, I believe, than there was last year as well. We've forecasted for the year, and we should be up quite a bit this year than last year.
Across the country, Quebec and Manitoba and Saskatchewan reported annual increases. However, Ontario, BC, and the combined Atlantic provinces suffered declines. The indoor lights at Coaldale Public Library were replaced thanks to a $2,300 grant through the Government of Alberta's Community Energy Conservation Program. Scott Boyd, Community Services Operations Manager with the town of Coaldale, says this grant allowed the library to replace its outdated fluorescent lighting with new energy-efficient LED fixtures. Boyd explains the benefits of this lighting change.
What that does for us is two things. One, it just creates a brighter and better space, for everyone that's using the facility, but also reduces both energy and greenhouse gases, which we're really excited about. So we're going from, the T8s, the incandescent bulbs, to LED lights. And when you look it up, we're looking at about 75 to 83% cost savings just on lights. And then from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, you're looking at about a 37% reduction in greenhouse gases, which is really nice to see as well.
Research indicates that LED lights offer benefits for vision, including reduced eye strain and a more comfortable visual experience. Taking Action is the Galt Museum's newest exhibition, which focuses on people and organizations that have made a difference in creating a social change in southern Alberta. The Indigenous curator at Galt Museum, Kamina Weasel Moccasin, explains change doesn't happen on its own. It needs people willing to roll up their sleeves and get to work. The curator says more about this temporary exhibition.
This exhibit highlights 8 specific events in and around the community that are moments of social justice or people standing up for social change. What we're excited about with this exhibit is that we've actually paired them with some of the Blackfoot values. So it's actually a variety of stories that we've tried to bring forward that highlight children to adults, things from the 40s, as well as to contemporary stuff as well. So one of the things that with this exhibit is that it really gets people to think about what their own value systems are. And if those values were, if you felt that they were being attacked or you felt that those values were in danger, would that kind of incite you to take a stand?
The exhibit is displayed from April 12th through October the 5th. A bit of a cloudy one today in Lethbridge with more precipitation than what we've been used to lately. 2 centimeters was expected today, in fact, but that sunshine will return, and so will we with the weather report.
Our 7-day forecast has us with a high of 6 with a chance of rain or snow today. Tomorrow we'll have a high of 7 with partly cloudy skies. Friday we'll have sunny skies with a high of 12, and Saturday will be sunny as well with a high of 18. Sunday we'll have a high of 9 with chance of showers, and Monday we'll have a high of 9 as well with a chance of rain or snow. Finishing off the 7-day forecast for Tuesday, we have a high of 12 with cloudy skies. Today's almanac has us with an average high of 14 degrees and a low of 0. The record high was set back on this day in 1984 with a high of 30, and the record low was set back on this day in both 1922 and 1953 with minus 12. The sun rose at 6:37 today and will set at 8:26 p.m. On to the national forecast. Vancouver and Victoria are going to be nice and sunny, with Vancouver getting a high of 14 and Victoria a high of 17. Edmonton will have sunny skies with a high of 9, and Calgary will have a high of 7 with partly cloudy skies. On to the rest of the prairies. Saskatoon will have a chance of rain or showers with a high of 7, and Regina is going to have a high of 7 as well, but just with a chance of showers. Winnipeg will have a high of 12 with a chance of showers. Central Canada is going to be nice and sunny, with Toronto getting a high of 12, Ottawa an 11, and Montreal a high of 9. On to the East Coast, Fredericton and Halifax will have partly cloudy skies, with Fredericton getting a high of 8 and Halifax a 9. Charlottetown is looking to have a chance of rain or snow with a high of 8, and finishing off our national forecast, we have St. John's with nice sunny skies and a high of 9.
The Bank of Canada is hitting pause after 7 straight interest rate cuts. The central bank is waiting to get a clearer picture of how tariff uncertainty is going to impact the Canadian economy, holding its policy rate steady at 2.75%. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem made clear the disruption from south of the border was the clear focus of today's decision.
Monetary policy cannot resolve trade uncertainty or offset the impacts of a trade war. What it can and must do is ensure that Canadians continue to have confidence in price stability. Our focus will be on assessing the downward pressure on inflation from a weaker economy and the upward pressure from higher costs. We will support economic growth while ensuring inflation remains well controlled.
A Canadian boycott of travel to the U.S. has prompted the governor of California to make a social media plea for them to come back. Governor Gavin Newsom's video message doesn't mention U.S. President Donald Trump by name, but encourages Canadians to ignore Washington, D.C. while returning to the Golden State for its wine, sun, and surf.
The Golden State and Canada have always shared so much in common. Sure, you know who's trying to stir things up back in D.C., but don't let that ruin your beach plans. California, it's the ultimate playground. 2,000 miles from Washington and a world away in mindset. From our iconic beaches and national parks to world-class wine, food, and outdoor adventure, there's something here for everyone. Last year, nearly 2 million Canadians visited California because here in California, we've got plenty of sunshine and a whole lot of love for our neighbors up north.
Canadian travel agents say their business to the U.S. has virtually dried up in the wake of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs and comments about making Canada the 51st state. Now, here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was up 38 points on the day to finish at 24,106. The Dow was down 699 points to 39,669. The S&P 500 was down 120 points to 5,275, and the Nasdaq was down 516 to 16,307. West Texas Intermediate oil was up 127 to 62.60 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 6 cents to 3.26 US. Gold was up 91.82 to 33.42.82 US an ounce. Silver was up 35 cents to 32.75 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.79 per bushel, barley is at $6.81, canola is at $15.25, and corn is at $8.18 per bushel. Live cattle were up $2.27 to $2.0707, feeder cattle were up 57 cents to $2.8995, and lean hogs May contract was up $1.95 to $90.15. And the Canadian dollar was even over the past 24 hours and currently sits at $72.20 US.
Recapping one of our top stories earlier this morning, the Leaders Debate Commission rescinded its invitation to the Green Party to participate in the 2 federal leaders' debates. Green Party co-leader Jonathan Pidneau says the last-minute decision to remove his party from the debate is unfounded and undemocratic. The commission cites the party made a strategic decision not to run candidates in every riding after initially telling the commission it would. Premier Danielle Smith announces the Compassionate Intervention Act. Also, measles cases have been reported in Alberta and clashes in the legislature. Lots to talk about with Tyler Dawson, Alberta correspondent for the National Post. That is all coming up next. Also, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. You can also visit our website anytime or our YouTube page to check out more of our stories and interviews.
There's lots to talk about in Alberta politics today. Alberta leading the nation in new home building starts. And it looks like mandatory drug treatment will begin soon in Alberta. Joining us now is our legislative reporter and the National Post's Alberta correspondent, Tyler Dawson. Hi, Tyler.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Lots happening. Alberta government finally introducing legislation to allow for mandatory drug treatment. Now, I think this policy was promised roughly a couple of years ago. Very controversial, of course, as well. But with all the drug crisis happening, the UCP government thinks this will do some good. Do you want to unpack that a bit for us?
Sure. Yeah, this was sort of an election promise in 2023, reporters have been checking in with the government sort of every few months since then to find out what the timeline was looking like on this, and the reality seems to be that it just took a couple of years to kind of figure out how to do it, to sort of look through all the research, to come up with sort of a structure for it that the government thinks is going to be constitutional. The way it's going to work basically is that someone would apply to a commission that will have a lawyer, a member of the public, and a doctor on it to have someone sort of apprehended and then put into these sort of mandatory treatment regimes. That could either be a 3-month stay in a secure facility, or it could be a 6-month sort of community kind of program. And there'll be, opportunities to review that. These decisions could be appealed to the courts if necessary, those sorts of things. But the timeline on it is going to be a little bit interesting because obviously these secure facilities aren't built yet. And the government is hoping that the system will be sort of fully up and running by 2029. In the interim, the regulations will be developed. Perhaps people will be put in, hospital beds or something like that in sort of the next year or so. But this is not like kicking off imminently. It's still going to take some time to shake this out a little bit. And of course, 2029 means that that's 2 years after the next provincial election. If the UCP wins that 2027 election, you can imagine that they would sustain this sort of policy. But you can also imagine a world in which the NDP wins that election, and then, what happens to this entire system if they form government. So I think it's fair to say this is a little bit up in the air. And of course, that doesn't even account for the other part of this, which is obviously going to be the legal challenges against it. The government is confident they're going to win. And of course, they could use the notwithstanding clause if they lose, but certainly that's going to be another factor in the months and years ahead.
Yeah. If they do lose, have they expressed as to whether they would go that far to use the notwithstanding clause?
No, they haven't actually. They've sort of been like, if that comes up, we'll deal with it when it comes up. They've been kind of cagey on the use of the notwithstanding clause generally, compared to Saskatchewan, for example, which has been a little bit more forthright. It's especially with, sort of the school pronoun stuff across the border there. And I think part of that reason is you set yourself up to lose the argument a little bit if you say, well, it might be unconstitutional, but, then we're going to, that's a perfectly legitimate political and legal point to make. But in terms of, trying to sell this policy to the public, I think you don't want to admit up front that you're even considering the possibility that something is contrary to the charter.
Yeah, again, it's just kind of one of those things, will this work or won't it, right? But I can understand the families who have a loved one who's, overdosed hundreds of times and they're out of options, right? And they don't want to see them die, right? So, will this work? And it's probably not going to work 100%, but, is it worth a shot? I guess we'll find out. Alberta, by the way, in the midst of that measles outbreak as well, speaking of health issues, haven't been any deaths so far, thankfully, but some are calling on the provincial government to make a bigger push to get people vaccinated. So, herd immunity, they say, requires 95% vaccination. Alberta not at that point, I don't think, right now. So, your thoughts on that?
We're close. I think we're 92.6% or something like that. So we're within a few percentage points. The issue, of course, is that there's a huge variation across the province. There's some communities where the vaccination rate's like in the 60% kind of range, which is obviously puts folks at a bit of a risk there. And one of the things that I didn't know until I was sort of looking into this stuff this week is that measles is like, it's maybe the most transmissible virus that, transfers in humans. It's much more contagious than COVID-19, for example. And of course, I think we've only had about 80 measles cases. The majority of them seem to have been resolved. But obviously, it's still spreading around the community a little bit. And so there's been this sort of mini controversy going on about whether or not the chief medical officer of health got involved early enough, whether or not the government's doing enough. And of course, then we found out on Tuesday that the chief medical officer of health, his contract was up on Monday. So he's out the door. And the government's going to be looking for a new one. So bit of an odd
is
scenario.
that directly tied to the measles case then, you think? Or were there other factors in here?
No, it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be just, sort of the end of his contract. He was on a 2-year contract after Dina Hinshaw left, and it seems to be up. But obviously the timing looks rather strange because last week everyone was like, where is he? Why is he not out talking about the measles outbreak? And then on Friday there was a statement put out, but no press conference or anything. And then we find out Tuesday he's gone. So I think it looks odd, even if it's, totally above board.
Yeah, and who knows? Again, maybe there was a last-minute decision on this, so maybe that affected his, delayed his action on the measles thing. I don't know, but yeah, interesting anyway. Well, the investigations, of course, into the AHS procurement scandal keep on rolling along. This week, though, the NDP moving a motion in the legislature calling for a judge-led public inquiry. Now, that didn't go through. It failed. But that one UCP caucus member voting for it, Peter Guthrie. Now, again, he was the former infrastructure minister, I believe, right? Before, well, he actually resigned with concerns over this whole government procurement issue, right? So do you think he's going to get kicked out?
Yeah, hard to imagine you wouldn't at this point, actually. I mean, that's a pretty big and bold step to take. I mean, I think I was surprised, actually, that he wasn't fully removed from caucus after he resigned, because he did call the government out in his resignation letter at that point as well. So I have to say I'm surprised he's still in caucus. Wouldn't surprise me at all if he was out of caucus by the end of the week or early next week. But I think there's about 6 investigations going on into this thing. You've got an RCMP investigation, an Auditor General investigation. There's a judge from Manitoba was appointed to look into this. But what the NDP is looking for was, something beyond that. Public inquiries have some more powers than some of these other groups. And Guthrie, as you mentioned, had expressed concerns with procurement, and so he voted in favor of that, as did actually, I think, Scott Sinclair, an independent. But as you also said, motion failed, so we're stuck with the existing investigations and not getting a new one.
Yeah, I'm curious if Guthrie has a lot of support for his stance within his own riding. I don't know if you've heard any feedback on that at all, or.
No, I haven't heard anything about that. And the UCP generally has been pretty closed ranks around this thing. And so far we don't have very much knowledge about it other than what's been reported in the media and what's been in sort of the dueling court filings over the firing of the former Alberta Health Services CEO. So, I think everyone's kind of waiting for these investigations to get to the bottom of it and hoping they turn something up, or hope they turn nothing up, I suppose, would be the other alternative here.
Yeah, well, it could go either way. I just don't know.
No.
And the report, I think the Ethics Commissioner report, what is that, due end of June, is it?
That sounds right. Yeah. The Auditor General's been looking, well, it might be 2 separate reports, actually, but the Auditor General's for sure looking into it, because there's this other little simmering controversy here where the government told people who were contacted by the Auditor General's office to forward the request to government lawyers instead of responding on their own, which the Auditor General's office says is, well, they're like, no, this isn't how it works. So a little bit of another controversy there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just ongoing. Okay, well, some good news for the UCP. Alberta building a lot of homes, and in fact, according to government stats, they say 25% of all new housing builds in Canada happening in Alberta. So I mean that's good news, I guess. And the province also funding, I believe, more than 6,000 affordable housing units, the construction of that. And so I'm curious if what's driving that? Is it a red tape cuts? I mean, what is it that's spurring this on?
I think there's probably a couple factors. I mean, the first is probably simple demand. There've been tens of thousands of newcomers to Alberta from, international migrants and also internal migration as well coming into Alberta in the last year or two. And so the demand has simply gone up. I think probably one of the other relatively significant factors, certainly probably in Edmonton, a little bit less so in other parts of the province, is changes to zoning rules. So Edmonton, overhauled its zoning rules. You can put up row houses, pretty much wherever in the city now. So I imagine that has really opened the floodgates a little bit on development and is probably a factor behind this. The other part of it too is that Alberta is still a relatively cheap market in the great. It doesn't feel cheap, of course, when people are out shopping for a new house or something, but compared to Toronto or Vancouver or whatever, it still is relatively inexpensive. So the demand also remains high there because people aren't sort of priced out of the market. The question, I think, is whether or not the market's going to cool at all. You'd think that if you had all this supply coming online at some point, prices would maybe start to ease. And they have eased a little bit, actually, especially in Calgary, where it was a very, very hot housing market over the last year or so. But an incredible statistic when you think about it. You look at the population of Ontario, for example, versus Alberta. And we've got a full quarter of all housing starts. So
yeah, so we're doing something right. So let's keep doing that.
And a great time to be in the construction business, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, ever since U.S. President Donald Trump announced his tariffs, the markets have been in an uproar. And this is also affecting oil prices, right? They've bounced around a fair bit over the last couple of weeks. And folks wondering what this could mean for Alberta's largest sector and tied in with that, of course, government finances.
Yeah, they say that every dollar between the price of Alberta oil, which is Western Canadian Select, and the sort of benchmark oil, West Texas Intermediate, for every dollar difference in price between the two, the government loses like hundreds of millions of dollars or something like that in resource royalty revenue. So, any up and down movement in the market has a direct impact on the amount of money that the government's bringing in each year. And it is a little bit all over the place. It's been down into the 50s. It's been in the 60s. It's really been bouncing around. And so there's the market side of it, but also OPEC, the other major oil producing countries in the world are planning to dump, I think, about 400,000 barrels of oil onto the market in the next few weeks, which will just have the effect of suppressing prices as supply goes up. And so the government revenue side is it's going to be a little bit iffy. I'm sure that's something the finance minister's office is watching very, very closely. But of course, then you've got the whole industry side of things, where an awful lot of Albertans are employed, an awful lot of wealth is generated in that sector. So, and you know what? Mostly it seems steady as she goes. It seems to be the indications coming from the sort of energy leaders at the moment, which is probably good news for people who are maybe a little bit stressed about their employment prospects or job security. That could, of course, change, but that does seem to be the general attitude at the moment. And there are some positive signs as well. The Trans Mountain expansion pipeline should be fully up and running this year. I believe one of the major LNG facilities out in Kitimat, BC, will be sending its first sort of tankers of liquefied natural gas over to Asia. Some other major projects under development there. So there are some positive trends, even if the markets are being a little bit alarming at the moment.
Yeah, that's hopeful. That's encouraging to hear that for sure. Okay. Alberta government hoping to encourage competition in the surgery budget. That's really interesting. So, how does this work exactly? How do you encourage competition when it comes to healthcare? Pretty interesting. Of course, when we're dealing with private healthcare, but here it's sort of some private stuff going on. And of course, I guess one of the concerns with this as well, is safety going to be impacted if there's competition? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's basically what my understanding of what they're going to be doing is, instead of giving sort of a lump sum surgical payment to hospitals and facilities, they're going to be saying, we're going to pay for every procedure done with, extra money sort of topped up based on complexity and things like that. So the idea basically being, if you could do more surgeries in the same amount of time, a hospital or surgical facility ought to make more money. So that's kind of the idea, is it's going to increase competition to get these things done, make more money for the particular institution. Maybe that'll make a more efficient system. You can imagine people are a little bit stressed if someone's normally taking an hour to do a surgery and all of a sudden they're doing 3 surgeries 20 minutes each or something. That might be a little bit of a concern. I don't really know if it's going to come to that, and certainly other countries have similar systems to this. I believe both Sweden and Norway pay for surgical facilities like this. So, but any tinkering around the margins of healthcare stuff always leads to a bit of an uproar, particularly from the NDP and some of the other sort of more progressive advocates in the country who fear the privatization of healthcare. And, you know, anything that looks like privatization of healthcare, there's going to be a bit of an uproar. So it remains to be seen what changes that will actually make sort of on the ground, but certainly a small controversy over that at the moment.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm actually thankful that they're trying to bring about some changes. I mean, you know, maybe it doesn't work. I don't know, but you know, we have to try. We have to do, I think, some experimentation. You know, carefully, obviously. You know, people's lives are at stake and so forth. But if it is working in other countries, and you know, I think we always hear this. We don't want to be like the Americans. In that sense, I probably agree. I don't know if I want American-style healthcare here, but I don't think that's what they're saying. Privatization is not uniquely American. I mean, we're seeing this in all kinds of countries that are very similar to Canada, and it seems to be working. So what can we learn from them? So I'm saying, hey, you know what? Yeah, we should maybe try some things here. Now, the Alberta legislature exploring whether to create a code of conduct for MLAs after, well, a few incidents, I guess, in the ledge. Briefly, what kind of clashes are we talking about here, and what kind of fixes are they proposing?
Yeah, the most recent one was between Raki Pancholi, the NDP's deputy leader, and Jason Nixon, who is the social services minister now, I think. I always think of him as the environment minister from the Kenny years. And they just had kind of an ugly confrontation over the trip that Danielle Smith made down to Florida to speak with Ben Shapiro. And it started in the chamber and I think continued outside the chamber with Pancholi getting in Nixon's face a little bit. So Speaker Nathan Cooper is saying that, you know, look, there's been some decorum problems here. Let's consider a code of conduct. And there will be a committee that studies it, and we'll see what comes from that. But it is a little bit funny because I think it was last week that the UCP proposed to eliminate codes of conduct at the municipal level, saying basically that they've been weaponized to control the behavior and stuff like that of municipal politicians. So perhaps they will decide they need a code of conduct, but municipal politicians won't. So that'll be kind of interesting to see where that.
Yeah, it's like where do you draw the line, right?
Exactly.
Because anything could be manipulated, I guess, for your own, you know, benefit, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
We've somehow got to learn to be, you know, like they taught us in kindergarten. Remember, you know. Treat others like you'd want to be treated. Be kind. You know, is that possible in politics? I think it is. Just get it done. Do it, people. Anyway, that's my little rant. Thanks so much, Tyler. Appreciate your time.
Always a pleasure being here. Thanks so much.
The Alberta government recently announced a significant change to how hospital surgeries will be funded. Instead of a lump sum of funding to be used however hospitals see fit, so-called activity-based funding will be tied to the actual care provided to patients. Hospitals with empty operating rooms would receive less funding, while private surgical facilities doing more surgeries more efficiently could receive more funding. Dr. Brian Day operates the Canby Surgery Center in Vancouver, a private surgery provider. He recently lost a years-long court battle challenging BC's Medicare Protection Act as unconstitutional. Dr. Day joins me today. Dr. Day, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, so Dr. Day, just as a bit of a background, your legal case started in 2009 and went to trial in 2016, right? And then finally ended earlier this year. So what were you challenging in court?
Well, it was, we were basically going to court to ask, you know, 20 years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada had given Quebecers the right to private health insurance, especially when the public health system wasn't performing, but it gave them the absolute right to get private health insurance. So we went to court to try and get the same privileges and rights under the charter for the rest of the country. And in their wisdom, the Supreme Court of Canada didn't want to hear that case because they were politically afraid of the subject. And you know, I think it's very important to understand, and this was evidence, we know this, but it was also evidence from an expert at the trial, that Canada is the only jurisdiction on the planet, literally the whole only country in the world, where government has banned private health insurance as a safety valve for the public system. So we're unique in the world. It's bizarre. So not China, not North Korea, not Cuba, only in Canada.
That's fascinating. So then, Dr. Day, what would your reaction then be to the news that Alberta is moving towards this patient-focused or activity-based funding model?
Yeah, no, what they're doing, it's not really a public-private thing. It's really logical what they're doing. So uh, every OECD country funds its hospitals on what I call and what Alberta's calling patient-focused funding. When I was Canadian Medical Association president, this is one of the main themes that I fought for in Canada. And we are unique in that among OECD countries in completely funding our hospitals by giving them a lump sum at the beginning of the year. So, you know, a large hospital might be given $3 billion a year, so that every patient that goes to that hospital is using up the hospital's money. In every other public system, it doesn't matter whether it's public or private, when the patient goes to a hospital in, say, England or Denmark or New Zealand, when a patient goes to the public hospital, they get funding by the government for their procedure. So the end result is that an administrator in a public hospital in other countries wants patients, because without patients they don't have revenue, whereas an administrator in a public hospital in Canada, the last thing they want is patients, because they use up their annual revenue. It's bizarre. Like, imagine going to a grocery store where the last thing the grocery store wanted was for you to, you know, pick up any items because you were using up the, you know, once that you took them, that was their money gone. I mean, it's actually the most bizarre thing. And it's one of the ways to improve the public system. That's been proven. It was proven in England under Tony Blair, a Labour Party leader, and it's been proven worldwide.
That's interesting. So in your opinion, where would they rather put the funding if not to patients?
Well, you see, the problem is it's much easier for a hospital to not have to serve patients. And the same applies not just to, say, going for a hip replacement. It applies to going into the emergency department. So you go into an emergency department in say, England, the hospital, public hospital, gets revenue from the government for the public patient. Here, again, the patients are using up the revenue. And that's partly explains why we have massive lineups and waiting lists, because the administrators, the last thing they want are patients. It's bizarre. And we fought for that, you know, so in 2008, that was when I was president of the Canadian Medical Association, that was one of our main themes. And it's been dabbled in by a few provinces, but there's a big problem with it. And the big problem is this: we have let millions of Canadians become, lining up on wait lists to get into hospital. If you suddenly introduce patient-focused funding, which is based on funding per patient, it's going to incentivize the hospitals, which is good. But then the problem is there's a big unfunded liability that it's going to cost a lot to get rid of the initial wait list. But in fact, the other important point is that in Canada, and we proved this again as when I was CMA president, it's actually cheaper to keep people, to treat people quickly than it is to keep them on wait lists. Because when you put someone on a wait list, they tend to deteriorate. And as they deteriorate, their medical issues often become more complex unless you're one of the 35,000 Canadians who die every year on wait lists.
So Dr. Day, really quick, so this type of funding model is obviously being used in other parts of the world, as you've said. So what have we seen in terms of wait times and outcomes in those places?
Well, I'll give you a quick anecdote. I had a visiting surgeon from Germany, where 90% of the public in Germany have public health insurance and 10% have private health insurance. And as a kind of, I knew the answer because I've worked over in Europe. And I said to him, well, someone with a hip or knee replacement, how long do they wait in the public system in Germany? He says, oh, it's a long time. I said, well, how long? He says, oh, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And he said, and in the private system, they only wait 1 or 2 weeks. So this is the thing. By introducing some competition, you improve the public monopoly, because without competition, nobody knows anything better because we aren't exposed to it. And it's well known. It's almost a rule of nature that monopolies do not serve consumers well. They don't need to, because there's no choice anyway. And that's what we have in the provision of healthcare for medical, for surgeries that are designated as publicly necessary.
All right. Dr. Day, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Now, on the flip side of this issue, this new funding model has been met with criticism from other groups, including Friends of Medicare, which calls this decision another blow to public hospitals. Chris Galloway is Executive Director for Friends of Medicare and joins us now. Chris, thanks so much for joining me and being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today.
Absolutely. Okay, so Chris, you call this type of funding a voucher system. So maybe explain that for us first.
Yeah, it's a common approach we've seen from governments looking to privatize, looking to pull apart public services, where you have the money follow the student or the patient or the procedure rather than funding facilities and institutions to do the work that's needed. And it really opens the door to create a market for private for-profit providers to now get public dollars to do some of the work. So, we've already opened that door in terms of surgeries with funding of private surgical centers that are for-profit centers. But now there's this new model that means they'll be able to push through volumes and to make even more money while undermining our public hospitals' capacity to provide those same services.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How do you respond then to the Premier's contention that because hospitals get their lump sum of money for procedures, there's no accountability and no incentive to meet targets?
Yeah, we've seen this talk about accountability. The government's really turned to blaming Alberta Health Services for any issue in healthcare right now. They've chosen that as a political strategy. But the government controls Alberta Health Services. They've fired the board, they fired the CEO. They're actually directly in control of the whole healthcare system right now. So whatever outcomes are happening are results of the government's leadership and decisions. They've made a decision to fund private for-profit surgical centers and not increase funding to public hospitals. They've been doing that for years. And the result of that is the capacity in the private sector has grown and the capacity in the public sector hasn't, because their funding hasn't kept up with population growth or inflation costs. So of course that's the result. It's not because of some nefarious Alberta Health Services plan to not provide surgeries. It was a choice of the government of where they funded surgeries and healthcare dollars.
Okay. How then would you respond to studies showing positive results with this funding model, like places like Quebec and some European countries, and I think even Australia?
Yeah, so the government has pointed to other jurisdictions like Ontario or BC. BC actually reversed this model because it wasn't working. If you look to Australia, they've had some major problems with their private hospitals. During the pandemic, those facilities actually threatened to close if the government didn't give them money to stay open through the pandemic. They're also struggling right now. So there's a lot of examples to look at where this doesn't work. You look at Ontario, where they're paying 2 to 3 times as much for the surgeries in the private centers versus the public hospitals. It's a very expensive approach that has been tried in many jurisdictions and usually abandoned because the cost of it isn't worth doing.
What about the volume of surgeries performed? Couldn't they get to more people faster?
Creating a new facility doesn't create new surgeons, anesthesiologists, nurses. It actually blows apart our workforce. If we were serious about shortening wait lists, something the government claims this agenda is about, but so far has not succeeded in doing through this privatization approach. If we were serious about that, we would open our operating rooms more fund them to do more procedures, longer hours. We could also do innovative things like have specialized operating rooms in the public system for knee and hip surgeries if that were a goal. They've chosen at every point to only fund more private surgeries and not actually fund our operating rooms to be fully open and at capacity.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because Quebec moved to this type of, model, I guess, targeted funding in, was it 2004? And there's been a Canadian public policy think tank, MEI, releasing the research from there, and it showed that by 2012 and 13, that year, it had significantly increased the volume of surgeries performed as well as decreased the wait times and lengths of stay. And it looks like similar results were shown in other countries like Australia.
Yeah, so when you look at those things, it's very hard to compare with other jurisdictions sometimes like Quebec, because how they do healthcare fully is different, how their hospitals are owned and operated. They have requirements for employers to provide health benefits that we don't, and other pieces. But if you look next door to Saskatchewan, they had the Saskatchewan Surgical Initiative. We have the Alberta Surgical Initiative modeled after that. When they did this in Saskatchewan, they paired it with a huge investment in public hospitals and public operating rooms. And that is why they saw a decrease in their wait times. They got more surgeries done. As soon as they ended that extra funding for the public hospitals, their wait lists are as bad as ours now. And they're looking at sending patients to Calgary. It's fully about decisions around capacity, workforce, and the number of procedures you're going to fund. It's not about the privatization suddenly reducing wait lists. That's never been true when you look at other jurisdictions. It's decisions about funding. It's decisions about how many procedures you're going to get done. It's decisions about the workforce to ensure you actually have the surgeons and nurses and other workers you need to do that, which is our biggest struggle in Alberta right now in healthcare, whether surgeries or any other procedure or facility. We don't have the skilled healthcare workers we need to keep things going. And that's what we should be focused on.
So if you are against this type of funding, what's the best solution, do you think?
We were calling going into the provincial budget that we need a plan for capacity and workforce for the system to actually look at the whole province, look at healthcare. Who do we have? How do we retain them? And then what skilled healthcare workers do we need to recruit and train to actually provide service across the province to Albertans? So we're not seeing long waits, closures, and gaps in care. That's the approach we would like to see. Actually map it out and do that work, and then make your decisions within that framework. Instead, we've seen one-off announcements of surgical funding, one-off announcements of other projects that aren't connected to an actual plan for how we're going to provide healthcare to Albertans and have the workforce we need to do that.
Chris, we appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Chris Galloway is Executive Director of the group Friends of Medicare. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.